For a few minutes after that, Sunny was in a dark mood, but then he pulled himself out of it and inhaled deeply, trying to savor the fresh air. Air like this was rare in the real world. Microdust and pollutants made the atmosphere rough and unpleasant, while the outskirts of cities reeked with the stench of decay. In the better parts of the city, sophisticated filtration systems worked tirelessly, yet the filtered air tasted sterile and stagnant. Only the very wealthy had access to truly fresh, untainted air, and here he was, able to enjoy an unlimited amount of pristine, delicious air, much like a second-generation Chable. Truly, being chosen by the spell has its benefits, he thought, his spirits briefly lifting. If only the cold wasn't so dreadful, his feet didn't ache, and his wrists and back weren't in constant agony. The slave caravan trudged slowly up the mountain, more and more slaves stumbling and falling to the ground as the hours passed. A few times, those too weak to continue were pulled off the chain and unceremoniously tossed into the abyss that loomed to the left of the road. Sunny watched them fall with a pang of compassion. Poor fellows. Rest in peace, you pitiful souls, he thought quietly. Despite the grim situation, Sunny felt strangely good. It was odd to feel a sense of relief amidst such a disastrous nightmare. But Sunny had prepared for this eventuality. The first time the symptoms of the spell had manifested, he had struggled to cope. Dying before even turning 17 wasn't something one could easily accept. But in the end, it only took Sunny several days to come to terms with it. After visiting his parents' makeshift resting place, just 2 lines carved into an old tree, since he was too poor to afford a proper memorial, and adding a 3rd line for himself, Sunny became relaxed and carefree. After all, he didn't have to worry about earning money, finding food, or protecting himself from dangers anymore. Once the worst had already happened, what else was there to fear? So, becoming a slave and slowly freezing to death didn't seem like much of a shock anymore. Besides, he knew the cold wouldn't kill him, simply because he had already seen what fate awaited the caravan further up the mountain. The image of piles of bones littering the ground was still fresh in his mind. Most likely, a pack of monsters would soon descend upon the caravan, and judging by the ominous sounds, the attack was imminent, perhaps in a matter of hours, not days. So, Sunny still had a chance. Seizing the opportunity, he decided to take another look at his status and summon the runes once more. The last time, he had been too enraged by his aspect to study his attributes properly. While the aspect was important, the attributes could be the deciding factor between life and death. They represented his natural traits and affinities, sometimes even providing passive abilities and effects. Fated. Description: the strings of fate wrap tightly around you. Unlikely events, both good and bad, are drawn by your presence. There are those who are blessed, and those who are cursed, but rarely both. Mark of divinity. Description: you bear a faint scent of divinity, as though someone briefly touched by it once, long ago. Child of shadows. Description: shadows recognize you as one of their own. Interesting. Sunny mused as he read through them. He quickly recognized the first attribute, fated, as the main cause of his predicament. At first glance, it seemed like it indicated that he was doomed to a specific fate, like dying miserably and vanishing without a trace. But after reading the description, he realized that being fated meant that improbable things had a higher chance of happening when he was around. I guess this is how I ended up with one of those super rare, useless aspects, and a weird variant of it at that, Sunny thought, a wry smile tugging at his lips. If fated was his innate attribute, then the other two must have come from his temple slave aspect. Mark of divinity was more straightforward. It was supposed to allow him to enter certain sacred places in the dream realm and enhance his sorcery. But there were no sacred places in sight, and his aspect had nothing to do with sorcery, so that attribute was useless as well. Child of Shadows was the strangest. He'd never heard of it before, and had no idea what it was supposed to do. That is, until the sun hid behind the mountain and the sky began to darken. To his surprise, Sunny found that he could see perfectly in the darkness, as if it were still daylight. This ability alone was far from insignificant, and it was possible that the shadows might grant him other, yet unknown, gifts. Finally, something useful. I wonder if he thought. Stop the caravan. Prepare to camp. Came the order from the head soldier. Following the command, the slaves dropped to the ground, exhausted and shivering. The small clearing where the road widened was somewhat sheltered from the wind by a protruding mass of rock, but it was still too cold to rest comfortably. The soldiers quickly got to work, herding the slaves into a tight circle, forcing them to share warmth. A large bonfire was lit in the center of the camp, though not before the soldiers tended to their horses. The heavy wagon, carrying food, water, and other supplies, was pushed forward to shield the group from the wind. As Sunny looked around, he spotted the young soldier from before, watching the mountain with a complicated expression on his face. What a weirdo, Sunny thought. Soon, the bonfire blazed brightly. The stronger slaves tried to get closer to the warmth, while the weaker ones, like Sunny, were left on the outer edge of the circle, their backs freezing in the cold. Of course, any movement was difficult due to the chains that bound them. As expected, the broad-shouldered slave found himself just as far from the fire as he had been before, despite his best efforts to inch closer. "Damn Imperials," he hissed, clearly irritated. The soldiers walked among the slaves, handing out water and food. Sunny, like everyone else, received a few sips of icy water and a small piece of hard, moldy bread. Despite its unappetizing appearance, he forced himself to eat it, only to find himself just as hungry as before. By the looks of it, he wasn't the only one. The shifty slave behind him glanced around, desperate. "By all the gods, they used to feed me better even in the dungeons," he spat, clearly agitated. "And most of us innocent men in the dungeon were waiting to meet the gallows too." A short distance away, where the paved road ended and sharp rocks began, a scattering of bright red berries grew from the snow. Sunny had noticed them earlier, appreciating their beauty as they stood out against the white snow. The shifty slave's eyes glistened with greed as he crawled toward the berries on all fours. "I would advise against eating those, friend," came a calm voice. Sunny turned around to see the gentle-voiced slave for the first time. The man was tall, in his 40s, lean, and strangely handsome. There was a dignified air about him, like that of a scholar. How someone like him had ended up as a slave was a mystery, but there he was. "You and your advice again. What? Why?" The shifty slave snapped. The scholar smiled apologetically. "These berries are called bloodbane. They grow in places where human blood was spilled. That's why there are so many of them along the slave trade routes." "So what?" the shifty slave asked dismissively. The scholar sighed. "Bloodbane is poisonous. A few berries might be enough to kill an adult man." "Curses!" the shifty slave exclaimed, flinching away. He glared at the scholar. Sunny, however, wasn't paying much attention to their conversation. As he looked around, he recognized the campsite as the very spot he had seen in his vision at the beginning of the nightmare. The place where the bones of the slaves were buried beneath the snow, and he was willing to bet that whatever had killed them was going to happen soon. And as if to answer his thoughts, a loud thundering noise rang out from above. In the next instant, something massive came crashing down from the sky.